All right, let's jump right into one of the most famous, most challenging, and honestly most influential academic essays of the 20th century, Gayatreya Chakravorty Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Now, it's a question that has been bugging thinkers for decades, and today we're going to try and demystify it together.
To really get to the heart of this big, complex idea, let's start with a feeling I think we've all had. That incredibly frustrating feeling when you're talking, you're making your point, but your words are just hitting a wall. Like you're making noise, but you're not actually being heard.
So, what Spivak does is she takes that very personal feeling and just explodes it onto a global scale. She starts to wonder if entire groups of people, millions of them, are being systematically ignored, systematically unheard. And to even begin to understand her question, we have to get our heads around her most important term.
So yeah, who exactly is she talking about here? Who are the subaltern?
Okay, so the term itself originally comes from the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, but Spivak uses it to describe the people who are truly, utterly dispossessed. And we're not just talking about marginalized people here, we're talking about those who are completely, totally cut off from any way up. They have no access to education, to power, to the political system. They're not even on the bottom rung of the ladder, they can't even get to the ladder.
Now, this is a really key point. Spivak's big question isn't about whether these people can physically make sounds or form words. Of course they can. The real issue here is about representation. It's about whether they can speak in a way that is actually heard, understood, and, this is crucial, acknowledged by the systems in charge.
For Spivak, you see, speaking isn't a one-way street. It's not just you shouting into the void. It's a transaction. It needs a sender and a receiver. And if you speak, but the person who is supposed to be listening is either unable or just unwilling to understand you and respond, well, did you really speak at all? The message just doesn't land.
And this leads us to another one of her major ideas, something she calls epistemic violence. Now, this isn't physical violence. This is a kind of harm that's done through knowledge itself, through history books, through research, through the media. When these powerful systems ignore or erase or just completely misinterpret the perspective of the subaltern, they are effectively writing them out of human history. That's a kind of violence.
To really hammer this point home, Spivak does something pretty brilliant. She digs into two German words for representation that show a distinction we usually miss in English. The first is vertreten. Think of a lawyer speaking for their client, acting as their proxy. The second is darstellen. That's more like an artist painting a portrait of someone. They're creating a depiction. Spivak's bombshell argument is that well-meaning intellectuals often think they're doing the first one, acting as a lawyer, when really all they're doing is the second one, just painting a picture.
So as if this wasn't all complicated enough, Spivak then takes us a level deeper. She identifies a group that's even more profoundly silenced. If the subaltern man is standing in the shadows, the subaltern woman is in a darkness that's twice as deep. It's a doubled silence.
And her own words here are just so powerful. She says, the subaltern woman is silenced twice over. First, she's silenced by the colonial power structure that oppresses her whole society. And then she's silenced again by the patriarchal structure within her own society.
To make this less abstract, she gives us a concrete historical example. She looks at the moment in 1829, when the British colonial government in India banned the practice of sati, which was the ritual where a Hindu widow was burned on her husband's funeral pyre.
The story that the British told themselves and the rest of the world was a very simple, very self-serving one.
In this story, they were the heroes, right? They were rescuing the poor, helpless victims
From the supposedly barbaric local men. It's a nice, neat little story where the colonizers look great. But this is where Spivak asks her most devastating question.
In this whole debate, this tug-of-war between the British colonizers on one side and the Indian patriarchs on the other, a debate that was supposedly all about her life, her body, where is she? Her voice is completely absent. She's not a person in this story, she's an object, something to be saved or controlled, never a subject who gets to speak for herself.
So after laying all this groundwork, this whole architecture of silencing, Spivak finally comes back to her original question. And she delivers an answer that is so famous and so deeply controversial. It's what this essay is best known for.
So can they? After everything we've seen, can they actually cut through all these layers of violence and misrepresentation and doubled silence and actually be heard?
No, her conclusion is stark and it is absolute.
The subaltern cannot speak.
Okay, now hold on, because it is so important that we understand what she means here. She does not mean they are literally mute or silent. Not at all. She means that the transaction of speaking fails every single time. They can shout, they can protest, they can write, they can cry, but the system, the very structure of power, is fundamentally incapable of receiving their message. Their words are not heard as legitimate speech.
And I know what you might be thinking. That sounds incredibly bleak, right? Almost hopeless. But the real power of Spivak's essay isn't actually in that shocking conclusion. It's in what that conclusion forces us to do next.
As you can imagine, this essay set off a firestorm. It became required reading in postcolonial studies, but at the same time, critics really went after it, saying it was way too abstract, even politically paralyzing. I mean, if they can't speak, what's the point of activism? Even Spivak herself, years later, admitted that maybe that one famous line was a little inadvisable because it got misunderstood so often.
But the real takeaway here isn't to just throw up our hands, give up. No, the point is to understand the true depth of the problem so we can attack it at its roots. So, step 1, we have to acknowledge just how deep this silencing really goes. Step 2, we have to be constantly critical of ourselves, especially when we try to represent others. And finally, step 3, the ultimate goal isn't just to help the subaltern speak, it's to dismantle the entire system that creates subalternity in the first place.
And this quote from Spivak herself just makes the real mission crystal clear. The whole point isn't to, preserve the subaltern as some interesting group to study. No activist wants that. The whole goal is to fight for a world where they are no longer subaltern at all, a world where they can finally be part of the conversation and actually be heard.
So in the end, Spivak's essay isn't really a final answer. It's more like a mirror that she holds up to us. It forces us to ask ourselves a really tough question. Before we rush in to speak for other people, to try and give them a voice, have we done the much, much harder work of creating a world where we can actually finally learn how to listen?